días a todas y todos. A nombre del Instituto de Estudios Urbanos y Territoriales y de la Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile, agradecemos su presencia y les damos una cordial bienvenida a la Conferencia Internacional con Laurajane Smith Patrimonio y usos sociales, perspectivas críticas. Esta actividad se enmarca en el trabajo del Núcleo Milenio Patrimonios, NuPats, dirigido por Macarena Ibarra, académica del Instituto de Estudios Urbanos y Territoriales UC. Para dar inicio a esta jornada, la vicerrectora de Relaciones Internacionales de la Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile, María Montt, dará las palabras de bienvenida y posteriormente la profesora Macarena Ibarra, directora del Núcleo Milenio Patrimonios, presentará a Laurajane Smith, destacada invitada internacional. Con mucho gusto, invitamos a María Montt a pasar adelante.
Muy buenos días y pido disculpas por mi atraso. Hice un mal cálculo, tomé mal una esquina básicamente. Y ahí estuvieron los 10 minutos en que me equivoqué. Muy buenos días a todos y todas. Es un verdadero privilegio darles la bienvenida y poder dar las palabras de saludo a este seminario internacional, Patrimonio y Usos Sociales, Perspectivas Críticas. Una instancia que nos va a invitar a reflexionar colectivamente sobre el patrimonio como una construcción viva, dinámica y profundamente entrelazada con las memorias y emociones y experiencias de las comunidades. Quiero saludar a las autoridades presentes, a nuestras y nuestros colegas de distintas universidades chilenas y agradecer sinceramente al Núcleo Milenio en Ciencias Sociales, Patrimonios, NuPats, por la invitación a participar y dar estas palabras en esta jornada. Este núcleo responde a una necesidad urgente en Chile: analizar sitios patrimoniales y sus proyectos de reutilización para abordar problemas sociales a lo largo de nuestro país. Conformado, y quisiera mencionarlas porque creo que es un valor especialmente importante, las diferentes instituciones que son parte de este Núcleo Milenio: la Universidad de Tarapacá, la Universidad Católica del Norte, la Universidad de Valparaíso, la Universidad del Biobío, la Universidad de Magallanes y nuestra Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile, que hoy les da la bienvenida. Nos honra contar hoy con la presencia de la profesora Laurajane Smith, referente mundial en estudios críticos del patrimonio. Su obra ha sido fundamental para abrir nuevas rutas en este campo y su enfoque ha reivindicado el rol activo de las comunidades en la construcción, defensa y resignificación del patrimonio. Nos desafía a repensar las narrativas oficiales y a promover una comprensión más inclusiva, participativa y transformadora del patrimonio. En muchas ocasiones, el patrimonio no recibe la atención ni la prioridad que merece en nuestras agendas públicas, académicas o institucionales. Sin embargo, sabemos que es un espacio, una dimensión clave para la construcción de sentido e identidad. Reconocer su valor significa también reconocer la diversidad de actores que lo sostienen, lo interpretan y lo proyectan hacia el futuro. Este seminario es una expresión del compromiso que tienen nuestros investigadores e investigadoras con la interdisciplina, la colaboración entre facultades y el fortalecimiento de vínculos con otras universidades del país y del mundo. Es una demostración de que la colaboración es fundamental para poder avanzar en los temas que nos son urgentes. Es también, y muy especialmente, una representación del rol fundamental que es tener una perspectiva global presente en nuestro quehacer académico y de comunidad. Los espacios de diálogo con referentes globales permiten aprender de otras experiencias y enriquece la mirada sobre las problemáticas que nos aquejan en Chile. Asimismo, sabemos que lo que en Chile se aborda puede también iluminar posibilidades sobre cómo pensar problemas sociales en otros lugares del mundo y qué rol juega el patrimonio en ello. No lo podemos dar por sentado. Debe ser un trabajo activo y continuo, y cada miembro de la comunidad debe ser parte de ello, en donde cada persona se atreva y pueda opinar distinto, donde se escuche la diferencia y siempre se dialogue con respeto y empatía. Porque, y hago referencia acá al trabajo de la invitada de hoy, ya publicado casi 20 años atrás, El valor patrimonial no es inherente a espacios u objetos físicos, sino que ellos son utilizados para hacer tangibles los valores presentes en las diferentes comunidades y para dar asertividad y reafirmar esos valores. El patrimonio, así, está inmerso en valores, sentido de pertenencia, de identidades propias e identidades grupales. En el marco del trabajo del núcleo NuPats, el evento de hoy nos invita a pensar el patrimonio desde su salvaguardia, sociedad y sostenibilidad, desde una perspectiva crítica y socialmente comprometida, que reconozca el papel transformador que puede tener el patrimonio en nuestras comunidades. Es algo que este mismo espacio que hoy nos acoge nos puede inspirar. Les deseo una jornada profundamente inspiradora que abra preguntas y nos acerque a una comprensión más humana, inclusiva y colaborativa del patrimonio y de nuestras diferentes formas de colaborar. Muchas gracias.
Agradecemos las palabras de bienvenida de la vicerrectora María Montt. Aprovecho también de saludar a las autoridades de la universidad aquí presente y a la amplia y diversa audiencia que nos acompaña, estudiantes, académicos, investigadores, personas de la sociedad civil, del sector público, del sector privado. Para el Núcleo Milenio en Ciencias Sociales, NuPats, es un privilegio contar con la presencia de Laurajane Smith en Chile, quien es además investigadora senior de nuestro milenio. La académica Smith es una de las investigadoras, como decía la vicerrectora recién, más influyentes en el campo de los estudios del patrimonio y también experta en su práctica. Es profesora de la Australian National University, directora del Center of Heritage and Museum Studies y miembro de la Sociedad de la Academia de Ciencias Sociales en Australia. A lo largo de su carrera, ha mantenido un interés constante en la política de la construcción del patrimonio. Es fundadora también de la Association of Critical Heritage Studies y desde el año 2009 ha sido editora del International Journal of Heritage Studies. Es coeditora general de la serie Key Issues in Cultural Heritage de Routledge. En 2018 recibió el título de doctora honoris causa por mérito científico de la Universidad de Amberes, Bélgica, y en el año 2021 fue galardonada con el Heritage Prize de la European Archaeology Association. Su obra, como decía María Montt recientemente, ha transformado la manera en que entendemos el patrimonio. Entre sus valiosos trabajos, podemos destacar su libro Uses of Heritage del año 2006, donde introdujo el concepto del discurso del patrimonio autorizado, que cuestionaba la idea de que el patrimonio fuera únicamente un conjunto de monumentos, objetos, y planteaba que éste debía entenderse como un proceso social cargado de memorias, de identidades y usos. Con su libro Emotional Heritage, el año 2021, puso en el centro las experiencias, memorias y emociones de las comunidades. Su reflexión es central, por tanto, e inspiradora en la misión y objetivos de NuPats. En tanto, como milenio en ciencias sociales, patrimonios, nosotros planteamos que sin usos sociales no hay patrimonio, y que el desafío está en vincular esos usos con los lugares, con las comunidades y con las prácticas que le dan sentido. Con gran entusiasmo, entonces, dejo a ustedes con Laurajane Smith. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much for, and I have just lost, there it is. Thank you very much for the very generous introductions. And I would like to thank Macarena and the Vice Rector for your invitation to come and speak. And I'd like to thank the NuPats team also for asking me to engage in the really interesting and important work that you are doing. So thank you very much for having me. It's an honour to be here. Okay, I need to acknowledge, as a member of the Australian National University and as an Australian citizen, acknowledge and pay my respects to the Ngambri and Ngunnawal people on whose land the university operates and on whose land I live, noting that sovereignty was never ceded. I also pay my respects to the communities on whose lands the research I'm going to be talking about today was undertaken. With that in mind, one of the things that I'm doing today is talking about current research, which has included looking at how Australians are responding to Indigenous issues at World Heritage Sites. So I'm just drawing your attention to the fact that some of the material I'll be talking about is very racist in its expression. Okay. The mobilisation of heritage in a range of political conflicts and movements around the globe has become more and more publicly visible. Ongoing challenges by left-aligned fallist movements to consensus national histories have targeted the legitimacy of colonial power. Statues of Captain Cook in the Pacific, Confederate soldiers in the US, slave traders in England, among many others, have been the targets of demonstrations that draw attention, referencing Michael Billig's notion of banal nationalism, to the banal racism that is every day reinforced by their pedestaled presence. These movements gained increased strength in 2020 with the public resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement following the murder of George Floyd in the US. Additionally, increasing calls by Indigenous peoples for museums and other heritage institutions to engage in repatriation and restitution are interlinked with demands for greater recognition by colonial countries of the ongoing material and material and cultural consequences of colonial incursions. Right-wing populists are enraged by what they characterise as the so-called rewriting of history and the removal of statues and the call for repatriation and of course their sense of injustice that they think the call for repatriations represents to them. While they in turn rewrite history in which ethnic minorities somehow become the victimised, ethnic majorities, I should say, somehow become the victimised dwellers of an imagined heartland defending threats to the so-called nation and its traditions from ill-defined elites. The past is a site of political and agonistic tensions, mobilised not simply to assert the so-called evidential nationality of the so-called rationality, I should say, of claims to the truths of historical and national narrative, but more particularly as a locale where people can emotionally legitimise and invest in those narratives. The past is, as Raphael Samuel argued, a theatre of memory, but it is also a theatre of effect in which emotions are managed, regulated, and deployed to legitimise acts of remembering. Heritage as a representation of the inheritable past, of a past that has direct consequences to contemporary constructions of self, group, and national identity, becomes not only a target for contestation, but also a point around which to exercise and manage the effective qualities of the past and its social and political meanings in the present. We cannot divorce the social uses of heritage from the political. In my talk today, I want to explore critical reflections, not only on the nature of heritage, but also its affective or emotional qualities. I'm arguing that heritage is ultimately not the sites, places, or artefacts that we often call heritage, nor is it necessarily the intangible events recognised by the UNESCO Intangible Cultural Heritage Convention. Rather, I argue, all heritage is intangible insofar as heritage is best understood as a performative practice of meaning making, a process in which things and elements we may call heritage are mobilised as the cultural tools to help us address the social and political problems of the present. So in developing this argument, I also argue it is important to understand the emotionality of heritage. Engaging with the affective or emotional qualities of heritage allows some element of insight into how the power of heritage and its ideological consequences have a material effect. Okay, there has been increasing professional calls around the world that institutions such as museums and other forms of heritage agencies have a professional and ethical responsibility to engage with current social debates. Both the new museology and critical heritage studies have called for interventions into public debates, an issue that is all the more imperative as the right increases its populist hold. Heritage and museum professionals, it is increasingly argued, should foster active messages about the nature of the past and its consequences for the present and future. However, they also need to do this in the context of navigating challenges to their own positions as experts and professionals. Heritage and museum professionals themselves face challenges from the right, but also from descendant communities who have called out the ongoing colonial, class and gender politics that tends to bolster the social position of heritage experts and their knowledge. Professionals are thus often caught in a bind. To understand this, it is also important, as I will argue, to identify the effective qualities and emotional repertoires of museums and other heritage practices, of which we may not always be aware and for which we as heritage professionals and researchers tend to take for granted. What I want to do is provide a brief overview of how I'm theorising the concept of heritage. I will then engage with ideas of affect and emotion. I'll then turn to the case study that examines the emotive power of heritage, its social and political uses, and its ideological implications. And then I will draw out the repercussions of this for ongoing research and practice. So much of my own work in heritage studies has been engaged with attempting to understand the phenomenon of heritage in different contexts and scales, and to identify the work, both political and social, that it does in society. To facilitate this aim, I re-theorise heritage not as a thing, place or artefact, nor even an intangible element to be placed on the relevant UNESCO list. Rather, heritage is something that is done. It is how we use heritage, either as material thing, museological collection, or intangible element. It's how we use heritage to negotiate the meaning of the past for the present. Heritage is a performance of meaning-making that selects aspects of the past to be brought to the present to help individuals, groups, and nations to address and regulate current social and political problems. Heritage is essentially about change. We bring the past to the present through the public process of heritage, however that concept may be defined by its users, to navigate this, to help us navigate social change. As we use those things or immaterial elements labelled heritage, we are actually engaged in a performance of heritage making. This heritage making can be done by individuals, families, communities, museum curators, and so on, as they collect and display collections, and by the states as they list material on national and international heritage lists. The World Heritage List, for example, is itself a performance of heritage making. The stuff on this list is not found heritage or inherently heritage. It is made and remade as heritage through the uses to which it is put. So in this idea of heritage, I am privileging people, while I'm also actively deprivileging the traditional way of seeing heritage as artefacts and monuments. I do this to understand how different groups of people define and use heritage and the consequences of that use for both group and wider society. Sites, artefacts, places, intangible elements are all cultural tools that help us remember, forget, and facilitate public and private negotiations over the meaning of the past. Heritage is a process that is ultimately about the navigation of cultural and social change, as I said, as well as part of the mediation of contemporary social problems and issues. This doesn't mean to say that things, sites, buildings, monuments, and so on, are not important, but rather what makes them heritage is how they are used in the present to address present-day issues and aspirations. The values and historical narratives associated with heritage are something that is continually performed or continually made and remade. The practices of heritage making are framed by different discourses, one of which is the dominant discourse, what I've called the authorised heritage discourse. This discourse has its origins in 19th century European debates within architecture, archaeology and art history, and the discourse continually recreates heritage as something material, grand, if not great, that must be preserved unchanged for the future. It stresses the idea of a common or shared heritage. As part of this discourse, experts become the stewards for the past and interpret the past for the education of so-called non-experts or a vaguely defined public. This is because the idea of material authenticity embedded in this discourse reinforces the idea of unchanging monumentality, of innate or inherent value, the idea that heritage is finite and non-renewable. This definition obscures both the links of heritage to the present and ultimately to audiences of, and ultimately to people, I should say. In the emphasis on materiality, people are forgotten or relegated to audiences of expert practice and interpretation. This discourse is continually authorised and reinforced by UNESCO conventions and other international documents such as the Economos Charter, all of which were written by heritage professionals whose thinking and practices were framed by the authorised discourse. In turn, these documents have also influenced the development of national legislation, policy and professional practice in many parts of the world, including Chile. Now, there are many, I want to stress this, there are many discourses that work in opposition to the authorised discourse or simply independent of it. Discourses that, for example, both influence and are influenced by material social structures and concerns such as gender, class, race, ethnicity, and so on, and the injustices organised around these social structures. The authorised discourse also varies across different national contexts, and it changes, however slowly and incompletely, in response to ongoing challenges. But in identifying the authorised discourse, my aim is threefold. First, to identify hegemonic practices and knowledge and to provide a device through which to analyse power in heritage practice. Didn't go. In privileging objects and sites over people, our critical awareness of the authorised discourse should remind us of the importance of people, that objects are just objects and it is people who make heritage and for whom heritage has consequences. Second, to draw attention to my aim was to draw attention to the diversity of heritage and heritage practices that sits outside of and is often marginalised by the authorised discourse. Third, my third aim was to simply challenge the authorised discourse and create a new, more democratic and inclusively critical, aware heritage or dominant discourse. And related to this point, I want to stress that the authorised discourse is not something that has its own agency and that it forces us somehow into certain practices. Rather, we make choices and we continue to make choices to use or not use this discourse. So in sum, I have defined heritage as a performative practice or process in which meanings about the past are continually made and remade for use in the present to help us address social and political issues. The practices will be framed by different discourses about heritage and how it is defined, valued, and understood. The dominant discourse, one that is authorised and embedded in professional practices, policies, and legislation, will be variations of the international authorised discourse. However, we can extend my definition of heritage further by looking at the issue of emotion. Now, in doing so, I make no significant distinction between affect and emotion. This is because affect is always, or emotion, is always contextual and discursively and culturally mediated and cannot be reduced to unconscious bodily responses. Affect or emotion is integral to cognition, the making and justification of social judgments, and to the processes of remembering. Emotions play an important role in verifying recollections and the meaning of the past. If the process of remembering feel right or are emotionally accurate, to use Adam Morton's term, or feel emotionally authentic, if you like, then those memories and the wider meanings and narratives they support are affirmed. Emotions are also the subject of feeling rules. That is, they are regulated by social norms, practices, social structures around such things as gender, class, among many others. And as Margaret Wetherell's idea of effective practice draws attention to how affect and emotion are both influenced by and influence social relations. The idea of practice here notes that social actions, whether we are talking about practices associated with heritage making or other forms of practices, are always framed by emotionally laden discourses and social norms and values. Emotional responses are also influenced not only by cultural or social context, but also by ideology. When a person chooses to care about what or when a person chooses to care about and how they are affected, how emotionally impacted they are, will be influenced by political beliefs and values. And I draw here on the work of John Yost, who argues that ideological positions and emotions help to frame the way an individual processes information. The psychological motive to manage fear and uncertainty will be pronounced in political conservatism. Conservatives are identified as uncomfortable with social change, and that fear of ambiguity and change is linked to political conservative tendencies to resist social change and to justify and accept inequality to maintain the status quo. So, in summary, I'm arguing that affect is a form of practice that is discursively framed and mediated. The heritage practices we engage in are negotiated and legitimised by the feeling rules of the affective practices in which we engage. Heritage meanings and narratives are charged with emotion that work to renegotiate or affirm and reinforce those narratives and meanings. This does not mean that practices and framing discourses do not change. Certainly, even repetitive and routine practices can be challenged, improvised, and changed. But what it means is that heritage not only is about negotiating the meaning of the past for the present, it is also about negotiating the immediate emotions and broader feelings we have about the past and its place in the present. Emotions are intricately tied up in the judgments and assessments we make about the past and its relevance to social problems. Emotional responses and the emotions we used in heritage making can be quite intense. Emotions such as rage, joy, pride, nationalism, hatred, and so on are obviously hot and I'm not going to be able to say that word. I'm too jet lagged, but they're hot and they're active. But they can also be expressed in flat registers. And by flat registers, I'm talking about emotions that are well worn by the person or social group expressing them. Emotions that are to a certain extent, taken for granted, not noticed, and on which reflection is not done. Such flat emotions are so commonplace in heritage making that they can be identified as banal. The idea of the objective neutral observer is an emotional state that we often do not notice or recognise, but it is an emotional expression nonetheless. Emotions can also be intense, as I noted, but yet also banal, insofar as that they are everyday and we don't notice them. For instance, intense nationalism can take on a banal aspect. One of the strong emotional consequences of heritage, especially heritage framed by the authorised discourse, is one of comfort. Visiting or engaging with heritage sites that addresses our shared sense of belonging and place often makes us feel comfortable, a flat emotion that often goes unnoticed or taken for granted. And this sense of comfort, or lack of it, as I will show in the case study I'm about to talk about, does a lot of work in defining the emotional consequences of heritage. However, it's also important to note that emotions will tend to follow what Ali Hochschild calls feeling rules. Work I've done in different sites and museums has shown that different types of heritage or heritage sites or different museums will have different feeling rules attached to them, or different accepted repertoires of emotional responses. For instance, sites of war memorialisation will have emotions of reverence, humility, gratitude as part of their affective repertoire, while sites associated with labour history, for instance, may have associated with them an affective repertoire that stresses angry empathy for workers against capital. They may foster community and individual self-esteem and engender feelings of ideological solidarity. The authorised discourse also has its own feeling rules. The feeling rules and emotional repertoires of heritage set out by that discourse stresses the emotionally grand, glorious and good, nationalism, pride, self-esteem, and other emotions of belonging and well-being. And these are so taken for granted that we often talk of dissonant heritage and the less positive or darker emotions of dissonance as something extraordinary and not part of everyday understandings or experiences of heritage. All heritage is dissonant, not only because any expression of heritage simultaneously includes and excludes, but also because there will be uncomfortable or shameful aspects of the past associated with any expression of heritage. However, heritage, according to orthodoxy, should stress shared identity and belonging, and this helps us to forget the shameful aspects of our past. So to recap, heritage as a set of performative practices works to constantly recreate meaning about the past for the present, while also recruiting our emotions to engage with that meaning. And that we emotionally invest in the meanings that we create. And this is an important point that I will come back to. So the case study. What does all this mean in practice? What does what I've been saying mean in practice? And I want to, whoops, went too far. I want to turn to a case study I'm currently working on in Australia, which, as I said at the start, looks at how Australian word heritage sites are used to foster or not acts of and concepts of reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. I've been interviewing visitors to Indigenous cultural sites that are on the World Heritage List and which often get used in reconciliation discussions within the Australian populist history and culture wars. Okay, so the sites are here, Lake Mungo in Western New South Wales, a site important for pushing back the history of Aboriginal occupation of Australia. Discoveries there by archaeologists in the 1960s resulted in the appearance on Sydney walls and protest banners of the 40,000 years is a long, long time. The date for occupation has now been pushed back to at least 60,000 years, but it was an important discovery at the time. And I do note Indigenous people argue that they have always occupied Australia and did not come from elsewhere. I've also worked at the problematically named Tasmanian Wilderness World Heritage Area, problematic as wilderness implies that it was unoccupied, a particular issue in Tasmania, where the site comes from, and where the myth that the Palawa all died out remains very dominant. Nonetheless, Indigenous history at this site is a significant feature and attempts to challenge the myth of Palawa extinction. And lastly, interviews were carried out at 2 rock art sites within Kakadu National Park. Rock art sites which are famous and significant tourist destinations, but are also key among the emblematic sites of Indigenous Australia. Now, the interviews, it's important to note, were done in the lead up to or not long after the Voice referendum of late 2023, in which Australians were asked to change our constitution to establish an Indigenous consultative group to Parliament. Alas, that referendum failed, with 60% of Australians voting no, and note, voting in Australia is compulsory. Now, the referendum was part of the reconciliation process in Australia, truth-telling and the reconciling of conflicting groups being the first step in this ongoing process. Australia has been actively engaged in long-term project of reconciling with Indigenous or First Nation peoples since at least 91, which was accelerated after the release of the Royal Commission into Prison Deaths and the Stolen Generations, and several major challenges to the legality of British occupation of Australia during the 1990s. And this process took a mammoth step backward with the failure of the referendum. However, the point to stress is that truth-telling and acts of recognition of Indigenous sovereignty and culture have been publicly visible in Australia for a long time, not least because various sectors of society and right-wing political entities push back at truth-telling and facilitate skirmishes in the long-term history or culture wars that has beset Australia since at least the 1990s. This very public war has focused on a range of issues, including the degree and nature of massacres, the use of the word invasion, the impact of stealing children, access to land, the legitimacy of celebrating Australia Day, and the validity of statues of Captain Cook, among many, many other issues. In this context, both history and heritage have become highly contested. Tensions are yearly played out, as I said, on Australia Day, between what a former Conservative Prime Minister termed the black armband view of history, and a view which acknowledged colonial invasion and dispossession, and that which historian Anne Curthoys dubbed the white blindfold version of a dying race that was supposedly civilised by the arrival of Europeans. Now, these are all issues that were rehearsed in the lead up to the Voice referendum, which was marked by disinformation spread by the Conservative opposition and the Murdoch press. Those against the referendum accused the process of changing history and of creating social division. Now, the Voice, it was simply a consultative group but, to give advice to Parliament, but this was characterised as too complex by the media and with too many unknowns and so-called hidden risks. And the campaign slogan became, I'm ashamed to admit, if you don't know, vote no. All of which consciously played on the fear of change and fear of ambiguity. And importantly, the fear of insecurity that lies at the heart of non-Indigenous Australian identity, that we are somehow not the real or that we are not real or the original Australians. In response, the Labor government offered a factual response. You know, if you don't know, go look it up. Here's the website. Basically, that was it. The campaign, it is not disputed, was not handled well. 12 months prior to the vote, polls indicated that the affirmative vote would win, but in the end, concerns about dividing the country led to a no vote. Okay, so turning to the data. 208 visitors have been interviewed across the 3 sites, and I used the basic survey instrument that I used in the book Emotional Heritage with 2 extra questions about reconciliation. And it's worth noting that while the referendum was a hot topic during the survey, only a handful of people organically raised the issue of reconciliation prior to the referendum, although references to the referendum increased after at sites that we were surveying at after its completion, and the significance of which I will turn to that point. I'll return to that issue. Now, as with my previous research, most people interviewed revealed that visiting sites, as with visiting museums, was about emotionally reinforcing or investing in what they already knew and felt. So here, a person at Lake Mungo is saying, you know, I come, people have got their own views. This place isn't going to change their views. And indeed, I would argue this is part of the feeling rules of heritage. Heritage is about affirming who you are, what you think, feel, and believe. The tendency in heritage practices to continually reference the idea that heritage is educational needs to be significantly rethought. No, it is not about education. It's about affirmation of what someone knows about themselves, what they know about their community and or their national identity, as the speaker here is stressing. When asked about the role heritage in general or the sites being visited played in peace building or reconciliation, many offered positive general statements that tended to reference the assumption underlying the UNESCO World Heritage idea that heritage should be about constructing peace in the minds of men, sort of thing. For instance, I mean, basically, the idea here is that people would express, you know, that they would just somehow inherently understand and be humbled and appreciative of what we have through their visit. In short, some felt that simply seeing or being told about the histories and heritage would somehow, maybe by osmosis, make people feel humble and appreciative, as UNESCO tends to assume. Some went so far to talk about the peacefulness of the heritage landscapes, and that this peacefulness would somehow imbue the visitor with a sense of peace, as these people are doing here. That they're I won't read you the quotes, but just to summarise, that they would, I've lost my place, that they would somehow get a sense that Australia was part of, it's part of the problem of getting older. I can't see my notes with glasses off, and I cannot see the slides with without my glasses. So that somehow that they would just, in this peaceful landscape, the idea that Australia was a real melting pot, that heritage is, you know, it's important for making us feel good, as heritage is as beautiful, it's beautiful, and somehow this beauty would help us find peace and well-being, is basically what these people are saying. Okay. And this, of course, is unlikely, but the unlikeliness of this is made further problematic by the fact that the idea that the landscape would somehow make us feel good references a trope in Australian society about the noble savage being one with the Australian landscape. But what they are reflecting on is, as I said, feeling good about themselves. While some talked about reconciliation as the meeting of two cultures, as one person put it, many more identified that reconciliation had to tell both sides or both histories. For instance, as this person's saying, for reconciliation to work, we have to look at both sides instead of being as one-sided as it is. We have to have the Aboriginal people reconcile where we are coming from. With some whilst with some explicitly seeing reconciliation as inherently divisive because they were required to consider another sense of heritage. So here, the Aboriginal heritage is being preference over the Anglo heritage in this area by Parkes. So it's unfortunately, it's a matter of division rather than reconciliation. Now, these responses are based on racist discomfort with having to engage with legacies of colonial history. However, there is a point to be considered. Reconciliation does need to engage with diversity of expression and experience. I'm not legitimising the racism that is evident here, but rather stressing that reconciliation does require an ability to see, understand, and accept an entirely different conceptualisation of history, the present, and aspirations for the future than your own. The effective repertoires or feeling rules of heritage simply, as yet, do not allow this. Feeling rules stress the idea of comforting shared heritage, a universality that cannot underpin real peace building and reconciliation, which must stress respect for diversity, if it is, of course, to succeed. Thus, a failure to really engage with what this means leaves the default conventions of feeling within the Australian authorised discourse free to reinforce a culturally insensitive and paternalistic feel-good melting pot where diversity is ignored or disrespected. At Kakadu, where interviews happened after the results of the referendum, respondents were much more likely to reference that referendum and its failures. This reference was inevitably an overture into the visitor launching into quite overt but emotionally flat, so taken for granted, racist assessments about Indigenous Australians. For instance, and to paraphrase some of these, I'll just paraphrase for you. Some suggested that in the Aboriginal past, people knew their place. Aboriginal people knew their place, while today they were more likely to be a political nuisance. That members of the stolen generations, the children that were taken from their families, that were raised in white institutions or families, had some higher IQs than other Aboriginal people and thus understood the need to conform to national values. Others identified Indigenous activists as an insult against the so-called civilising benevolence of white society. These sentiments were not hotly expressed in outright rage and hatred, but flatly and comfortably. They were comfortably stated as taken for granted. Racism post the referendum has become more publicly acceptable for some people. Issues of reconciliation and associated calls for recognising diversity could be rendered unproblematic or comfortably dismissed. Interviewees took comfort in what they perceived as a shared performance of visiting. What they saw as the aesthetic World Heritage sites at Kakadu, often assuming, and of course they were often, alas, right, that other visitors shared their values and opinions. Visiting was a collective performance of seeing key Australian heritage sites, and in doing so, reinforced the common sense, in Gramsci's meaning of the term, the common sense narratives about the Australian past and present. Moreover, this performance was comforting. Hatred for Indigenous peoples was performed and recreated as banal indifference. The prettiness of the rock art could be enjoyed, and comfortable affirmations of indifference and the social status quo between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples maintained. Slightly brighter note, other respondents, particularly those from younger generations, she says with relief, when asked about reconciliation and peace building, vaguely thought it was a good idea, but didn't see how heritage could help. This uncertainty about the role of heritage was expressive of several issues that highlighted the affective or emotional nature of heritage and its feeling rules. First, the authorised rules or effective practices of heritage stress the emotion, as I've been stressing, the emotionally comfortable, and of course pride and other uplifting emotions. Here a person at Mungo notes, if I'm being frank, heritage, it's easy street. It's the path of least resistance. Yes, of course you have to be informed, but I feel sometimes heritage avoids the big issues. And they go on to note that heritage facilitates people looking into the past. The present, as she notes, is where the issues lie, and heritage tends to stop there in the present, in the past, rather than asking the question of what next. Additionally, as yet another noted, heritage can be identified as being about stuff and not people. In this extract, the speaker is struck by the representation of the thousands of generations of occupation at Lake Mungo. So the top picture comes out of the interpretive material at the site, and each of the figures represents 10,000 years. And they go in the imagery of the family, of the people on the wall. They thought, this is huge. They were awestruck by the depth of time. How do you connect? And he's asking, how do you connect the story of those generations to today's conversation about reconciliation and peacemaking, truth-telling, or whatever it is, as they go on to say. And he goes on to note that such messages about reconciliation get lost because he got caught up with some pretty stuff. In this case, the shearer's shed. And in the Australian context, I should note that a shearer's shed constitutes pretty, at least romantic. And that artefacts, these romantic artefacts, become the focus of the heritage gaze, and they do not translate people's cultural and historical experiences, especially when they are so very different from your own heritage. So for him, and I would suggest the authorised discourse, the effective practice of heritage promotes looking at pretty or romantic things rather than people. As he says, I just got caught up in the shearer's shed, got caught up in the stuff. Many people did mention how difficult it was for people to engage with the idea of Indigenous history, particularly at Lake Mungo and Kakadu, because the sense of deep time at these sites was so very confronting. People supportive of reconciliation question the utility of World Heritage Sites for this purpose because of conceptually how very far away they were from non-Indigenous Australians' experiences, but also because relatively few people would be able to go to remote places in which these sites occurred. As one person notes with respect to Mungo, it's hot. It's hot, it's hard, it's sweaty, there's flies. I'll let you read the quote. So in conclusion, heritage is a process of using the past and its emotional registers to address social problems in the present. In this case study, heritage was actively used to help those I interview navigate their sense of social place and national identity in the context of the 2023 referendum, which asked the Australian people to recognise Indigenous sovereignty. Such recognition has to acknowledge the history of colonial disenfranchisement, and thus it calls into question the comforting pride many Australians may make in their national heritage and identity. The routine use of heritage to navigate social and political problems, either for good or ill, has a range of implications for heritage professionals and research. So what are the core takeaways of this case study? The issue of how to cross the divide created by heritage feeling rules is an issue I want to stress. In any proclamation of heritage, there will be an unspoken assertion, this is mine, but it's not yours. And this will be coupled with the contradictory expectation that heritage is also something shared. Also unspoken is the idea that heritage should make us feel unambiguously good, if not proud. And this is expressed both quietly and hotly. Heritage is about reinforcement and affirmation. Physical and emotional discomfort and ambiguity, on the other hand, are simply not part of the feeling rules for heritage making. Work in heritage studies that combines the study of emotions with understanding how mobilising the past as heritage is both dependent on and productive of political issues in the present may offer useful ways of thinking through the uses of heritage in mediating social problems. Those wishing to intervene as calls in critical heritage studies, new museology and so on ask us to do. If we want to intervene, and if we want to intervene progressively and engage with social debate, public debate, we need to engage with the emotional investments and meanings that people create with heritage, with their own heritage performances and practices. We need to start working in ways that aim to explicitly and constructively subvert the comforting uses of heritage, as this will be vital to the development of progressive social aspirations and narratives. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you. I can see you now. To the table. Yes. That slide. For those interested, here are some of the references I cited when I was talking. Yeah. Giving you away.
Bueno, muchas gracias. ¿Se escucha? Sí. Bueno, agradecemos profundamente a Laurajane por esta iluminadora, fresca y tan interesante conferencia. ¿Se escucha? Creo que sí. Vamos a dar inicio a una mesa de conversación donde con los profesores, la profesora Stefani y el profesor Gómez, a quien voy a presentar, para comentar algunos hilos centrales de la presentación de la profesora Smith y luego dar inicio a preguntas, comentarios por parte de la audiencia. La profesora Carolina Stefani, socióloga, doctora en sociología, directora del programa de doctorado en ciencias sociales de la Universidad de Tarapacá, es investigadora principal de NuPats e investigadora de COES. Su trayectoria se centra en los estudios migratorios de Chile y América Latina. Por otra parte, el profesor Joseph Gómez Villar es museólogo e historiador del arte, académico de la Escuela de Arte y del Instituto de Historia de la Universidad Católica, cuyas investigaciones actuales abordan los patrimonios afrodescendientes en perspectiva crítica. Vamos entonces a darle la palabra primero a la profesora Stefani y luego a... Gracias.
¿Ahí prendió? Sí. Bueno, muchísimas gracias, Laurajane, por su exposición, que nos ha brindado un espacio y un tiempo para detenernos a pensar elementos clave para la comprensión del patrimonio. Su aproximación ha sido y continúa siendo una fuente de gran inspiración, y es muy gratificante ver cómo estudiantes, funcionarios públicos, miembros de organizaciones sociales, fundaciones y académicos y académicas se han reunido hoy día para escuchar sus reflexiones a partir de su trabajo empírico, riguroso y novedoso, que problematiza no solo las tradicionales concepciones del patrimonio, sino los alcances que tiene al comprenderlo desde una mirada crítica. Quisiera detenerme en una de las dimensiones que ha señalado como parte central en la construcción del patrimonio, el rol que juegan las emociones en las prácticas performativas que producen precisamente el significado del patrimonio. Las emociones cumplen un rol central en las nuevas configuraciones que adquiere el reconocimiento y la constitución del vínculo social en sociedades crecientemente individualistas y mediatizadas por las relaciones de mercado. Durante décadas, las emociones estuvieron relegadas al ámbito de lo sentimental, como algo opuesto a la racionalidad moderna, una suerte de impedimento para avanzar en el desarrollo del conocimiento, supuestamente neutral y alejado de todo aquello que nos hiciera sentir. Sin embargo, desde la sociología del cuerpo y las emociones, diversas autoras y autores plantean que las emociones no solo no son opuestas a la racionalidad, sino que son las que guían el conocimiento, las que orientan y construyen las formas de aproximarnos a la comprensión de la realidad. En las emociones encontramos una serie de claves analíticas valiosas para comprender la complejidad, por ejemplo, de fenómenos sociales como son el avance de las ultraderechas en el mundo, la movilización social en torno a demandas por justicia y equidad, las reivindicaciones y luchas de los pueblos originarios o el movimiento feminista, entre otros. El interés renovado por los afectos en el campo de las ciencias sociales y las humanidades y la apuesta por dar centralidad al actor sintiente con su potencialidad de afectar y ser afectado, actuar y conectarse, permite a Laurajane traer a un primer plano esta dimensión poco observada antes en los estudios de patrimonio. Se trata de una propuesta sumamente interesante porque implica vincular la comprensión de un patrimonio que se construye en la práctica del uso con una dimensión de las relaciones sociales que reivindica el afecto como elemento constitutivo de la interacción, la construcción de significado y el reconocimiento social, abriendo un espacio para fisurar el binario alterizante entre nosotros y los otros. Junto con Sara Ahmed, Laurajane no invisibiliza ni deja de considerar el posicionamiento de los actores ni las estructuras sociales que determinan las interacciones e identidades. Es decir, las emociones no son neutras o externas al poder, se constituyen en las relaciones de poder, pero también permite conectarnos con otros distintos y desdibujar las jerarquías sociales. Emociones como la indignación, el dolor y la rabia por una situación de injusticia permite identificarnos y reconocernos en el otro. La solidaridad como respuesta a la precariedad e injusticia moviliza, por ejemplo, en el caso de las organizaciones sociales, una energía emocional que instala prácticas y confianzas. La fiabilidad y la credibilidad involucradas en el amor filial, erótico y también colectivo, así como los mecanismos de soportabilidad social, constituyen también espacios de transformación que residen en esa práctica transversal de ser parte de una formación social que se construye y reconstruye cotidianamente. El patrimonio, por tanto, moviliza múltiples y muchas veces contradictorias emociones que guían las acciones de los actores en su interacción con los sitios patrimoniales. Genera sentimientos de identidad, sean identidades locales o nacionales, cuando se visitan lugares patrimoniales, como podría ser Barrio Matadero en Santiago, el Puerto en Valparaíso o la calle Baquedano en Iquique. Moviliza sentimientos de injusticia y rabia cuando estamos frente a un símbolo del colonialismo o el patriarcado, como es la amplísima presencia de monumentos asociados al poder masculino y, por contrapartida, la escasa presencia de monumentos que refieren al rol que ha jugado la mujer en los múltiples ámbitos de la vida social. Genera afecto cuando visitamos lugares patrimoniales vinculados con nuestra historia familiar o biográfica, como cuando los hijos y nietos visitan una salitrera en La Pampa. Genera dolor y esperanza cuando visitamos sitios de memoria como el Parque por la Paz Villa Grimaldi o el Memorial de Natino Parada y Guerrero y tantos otros a lo largo de nuestro país. Lo interesante, tal como plantea Laurajane, es que estos afectos movilizan prácticas de uso, habilitan el reconocimiento y permiten, por tanto, la construcción de comunidades patrimoniales. Quizás radica allí, en el afecto y las emociones, la posibilidad de trascender la frontera que separa unos de otros. Es verdad que potencia el vínculo con los semejantes, pero a la vez permite superar las distancias sociales cuando nos acercamos y construimos en conjunto el significado de un sitio patrimonial. Muchas gracias.
¿Aló? Sí. Bueno, primero de nada agradecer a a todos los presentes, todas las presentes, a Laurajane, a Maca por su maravilloso proyecto MuPat. María siempre cumple con el patrimonio. Bueno, a todos los presentes. Voy a ser un poco más informal. Muchas gracias, Carlos, por la presentación que acabas de hacer. Creo que todo quedó muy claro. La presentación de Laurajane puso todos los puntos en su sitio. A mí me gustaría bajar un poco justamente el marco epistemológico, ontológico que nos ha entregado Laurajane Smith. Aquí muchos alumnos están contentos porque en sus tesis, en sus trabajos de grado, han usado mucho sus conceptos, sus libros, ¿no es cierto? Por ahí alumnos con mucho cariño que se acercaron para transmitir ese cariño también a Laurajane. Pero quería bajar un poco esta manera de entender el patrimonio, muy bien explícita, al rol académico, a nuestras investigaciones, a nuestras prácticas académicas y docentes, y lo difícil que es muchas veces, obviamente, cambiar de paradigma. Nos cuesta mucho trabajo. Entonces, claro, pero quería primero que nada enfatizar lo relevante que es en el trabajo de campo. Yo me formé en una escuela de museología que era meramente técnica, ¿no? La École du Louvre, era por problemas de iluminación, de conservación preventiva. No se discutía mucho en torno al significado. Pero cuando uno va al trabajo en terreno, entonces se encuentra con que esto que estamos hablando acá, el patrimonio como performance, como práctica, como creación, no es una entelequia, no es una postura o una impostura académica, sino es lo que uno se encuentra en la realidad. Y voy a hacer referencia a mi propia experiencia, un poco para personalizar esto, no como referencia intelectual ni mucho menos, sino como una bella experiencia de campo. Por ejemplo, cuando estuve con los mapuches en Ramopuy Huapi, me acuerdo que fui, obviamente, a ver qué pasaba allí, sin ningún tipo de preconcepto, y me encontré con muchísimas cosas que no esperaba. Y al final del trabajo, el concepto que apareció con la comunidad fue el de nostalgia sanadora. Y esa nostalgia era la que permitía imaginar cómo sanar todos los problemas que tenían al interior de la comunidad. No era solo con otros actores, era también una solución emocional, ¿no es cierto? Una reconstrucción imaginaria, afectiva, en torno al pasado, llena de nostalgia, de pasión, para resolver el presente. Y bueno, y ahí salió un artículo que Laurajane tuvo la gentileza de publicar. Se llamaba así, ¿no? Nostalgia sanadora. en el International Journal of Heritage Studies. Entonces, algo que uno se encuentra en la práctica. Cuando también, por ejemplo, estuvimos en el proceso que se dio en el Museo Histórico Nacional, se hizo una consulta pública muy grande, participaron muchos actores, y al final, obviamente, algo que salió y que era muy importante y también quedó como un concepto fue este tema de un poco de modificar el pasado identitario, es decir, era una modificación del pasado la propuesta, y una de las emociones que transitaba en casi todos los actores era el orgullo inclusivo, y así le llamamos, ¿no? Inclusive Pride, porque era finalmente este deseo de que la nación estuviera llena de diversidades y muy diversos actores. También, bueno, fue muy grato lo que ocurrió también cuando estuvimos en Quillagua, con los aymaras, y cómo ahí la construcción del sentido de ancestría y todas las emociones que constituían en el fondo su interacción con el patrimonio estaba muy motivada por lo que los arqueólogos y los antropólogos habían hecho. Entonces, la comunidad estaba como, de alguna manera, lo digo muy entre comillas, forzada a construir su sentido de ancestría desde la perspectiva de los arqueólogos y los antropólogos. Sin embargo, estaba todo el mundo del salitre, ¿no es cierto?, que era el mundo de sus memorias. Y ahí uno ve también el palincesto, ¿no es cierto?, en la construcción de relación con el patrimonio y en sus performances patrimoniales, cómo dialogar con la tradición aymara y un mundo muy vivo y de memoria muy fuerte y muy potente que es el mundo del salitre. Entonces, yo creo que también pasó con los canteros, ¿no es cierto?, los canteros de colinas, ¿no es cierto?, cómo finalmente el proceso, la amenaza inmobiliaria, procesos que se dieron legales, influyeron muchísimo en cómo ellos empezaron a reinventarse y a reconstruirse y a crear su propio imaginario patrimonial. Y hasta salió un historiador autodidacta que empezó a construir la historia de los canteros. Y hacían además viajes por el centro de Santiago y decían, estas calles las construimos nosotros, ¿no es cierto?, estos adoquines, estas piedras, etcétera. Entonces, como un fenómeno social muy complejo, cargado también de muchas emociones. Y en última instancia, y aquí voy a cerrar un poquito porque me interesa que ustedes participen, pero es para un poco dar la experiencia de cómo nosotros influimos también en el campo patrimonial. El trabajo con la comunidad afrodescendiente migrante en Chile. Aquí tenemos, por suerte, presencia de esa comunidad. Y claro, cuando empezamos a trabajar, quisimos también invertir el proceso, no solo que el académico fuera a las comunidades, sino que las comunidades vinieran a la universidad, nos cuestionaran nuestro trabajo, nos interrogaran y participaran, ¿no es cierto?, del trabajo académico. Y bueno, creo que cuando en 2022 salió el concepto del cuerpo de la mujer negra como patrimonio, los sesos volaron porque era, creo que, algo tremendamente fuera de canon y tremendamente relevante. ¿Y por qué? Bueno, porque sentían que sus cuerpos eran portadores de memorias, ¿no es cierto? Eran portadores de tradiciones, eran portadores sociovisualmente de todo un conflicto histórico vinculado a la esclavización, etc. Y por lo tanto aparece un concepto tan fuerte emocionalmente como este. Y el problema no solo, y con esto cierro, es que, claro, cada vez que nosotros hicimos un trabajo, por ejemplo, cuando lo hicimos en Quillagua, Palape nos pidió que lo ayudáramos a presentar eso frente a la comunidad y también frente a las autoridades. Entonces, hay una influencia del pensamiento más sistemático, académico, también en la interacción. Es decir, hay una responsabilidad súper fuerte. Lo mismo pasó con los mapuches en Ramopuy Huapi, ¿no es cierto? Es decir, Adrián, el lonco, me dijo, necesito todo eso que hemos conversado, sistematizado, porque quiero hablarlo con el Consejo de todas las Tierras y quiero también presentarlo frente a las demandas que tenemos en la CONADI. Bueno, y así sucesivamente. Entonces, de alguna manera, quería subrayar la relevancia del actor académico en este digamos, en este conjunto, en esta red de actores que actúan y que intervienen en el patrimonio, y cómo nuestras perspectivas, en el fondo, en diálogo con las comunidades, van produciendo, van creando también patrimonio. Es decir, es un acto de creación total. Y bueno, en ese sentido, volver a agradecer esta mirada sobre el patrimonio porque para nosotros ha sido tremendamente enriquecedora, pero no solo académicamente, creo que muchas comunidades se han beneficiado muchísimo de vuestro pensamiento y de vuestras perspectivas. Las han incorporado y las han hecho parte también de sus reclamos, demandas, ¿no es cierto?, y participación en la vida social. Así que muy agradecido. Y en nombre de todos. Sí.
Gracias a ambos por sus comentarios. Vamos a ofrecer la palabra a quienes quieran hacer preguntas. Pueden levantar su mano. Podríamos juntar quizás las dos. Veamos.
Ya, a ver. Por allá, si me ayudan a pasar el micrófono.
Eh, Primero, la pregunta la hago en español, en inglés, en español,
¿Escucha?
no sé. Ok. Durante la conferencia mencionó la relación entre patrimonio y educación que parece estar siendo cuestionada por los que visitan estos sitios patrimoniales. Y ahí surge la tesis de que el patrimonio no es sobre la educación, sino es más bien sobre la reafirmación de identidades ya cristalizadas o consolidadas. Pero pienso también en los problemas contemporáneos que nos afectan, la crisis climática, por ejemplo, y cómo se concibe ese rol educativo que creo que también está presente dentro del discurso patrimonial autorizado, pero cómo se concibe quizás desde este enfoque emocional y afectivo.
Allá atrás, allá arriba.
Muchas gracias. Junto con felicitar la presentación, tengo una pregunta muy sencilla. Me gustaría alguna referencia a la relación entre patrimonio y futuro. Mi nombre es Patricio Gross.
Hola, muchas gracias por tu presentación. Eh, sí, yo quería preguntar un poco, o si pudieras profundizar en algo que a mí me llama la atención cuando se presentan estas nuevas, hola, Joseph, cuando se presentan estas como perspectivas sobre el patrimonio creativo, construido, etcétera, como algo performativo. Y en esta performatividad yo me pregunto por la no correspondencia a veces, o por la correspondencia o no correspondencia entre el discurso y materia. Pareciera a veces como que las narraciones o las emociones encuentran su materialización discursivamente. Eh, entonces, quería preguntar si puedes profundizar quizás en cuáles podrían ser por ejemplo, no sé, cuál es, cómo la nostalgia, por ejemplo, por el futuro, como la nostalgia sanadora o estas nostalgias que son un trabajo de futuro, como que encuentran su manera de importar o de materializarse, como comes to matter, de pronto, si puedes como profundizar en eso.
Okay. Yep, I'll respond to the first three, and I'll actually respond to them in sequence because they build up. They're linked in ways that I see as useful. So heritage and education is the first question. And there is a long tradition, of course, in museology and heritage practice of assuming that we are engaged in the process of educating various audiences. And the assumptions are that people go to these places to be educated. In the work that I did in the book, Emotional Heritage, what I found was that actually most people talked about how these places reinforced what they already knew, felt and believed. And when they talked about education, they inevitably talked about these sites as educational for someone else other than themselves, for kids or for migrants or whoever. And this was a finding that others have also had. So researchers at the Smithsonian, for instance, tend to have their work tended to suggest that people also go to meet their expectations and don't necessarily like to have their expectations of what they're going to see and find challenged. And certainly when visitors were met with cognitive dissonance, when they were feeling challenged by what the interpretive material was telling them, they tended on the whole to engage in a range of emotional responses that shut down the negativity that they were feeling and reinforced their sense of comfort, going through all sorts of discursive somersaults and gymnastics to get to reinforce their sense of comfort. And I think, I mean, I know we want it to be educational, and it doesn't mean that it can't be. I mean, okay, I'll come back to that point, but an important point to stress is that the emotionality of heritage is about affirmation. It is about feeling emotionally good. And if we really do want to use museums and heritage sites to challenge, we need to understand the effective nature of heritage. We need to understand what it is that heritage does to make people feel certain things. And in understanding that, we can use the emotionality to challenge people's understanding and to get them thinking in new ways that may be educational. You make the point that people go to, to go to sites to deal with modern day issues such as climate change. The research that I've done, the research that people from the Smithsonian and various other research in Europe has shown, is that people make choices to go to sites that are meaningful to them. And they're already most of the way there. If they're going to visit, for instance, a site on climate change, they're already most of the way there about understanding that climate change is real. You don't get climate deniers going to these places and going, oh, hallelujah, I've seen the light. And the other point that I would make in relation to that is that we know now that the facts of the matter don't persuade. We've seen this again and again, particularly the uptake of right-wing populism. People are voting against their best interests in voting for people like Trump, Bolsonaro, etc. Why are they doing that? They're doing that because the right has very cleverly, in a way the left has not, been able to invoke and engage and understand and use people's emotional responses. Facts don't persuade necessarily. I mean, they persuade some of us, but for many, they don't. The emotionality of those facts has to be understood and engaged with to help to persuade. So I'm saying, if we really want to engage in education, we want to engage in social debate, engage with the emotionality of heritage, because that will get us to that educational desire that we have. Facts alone won't. And moving to the comment about the future, heritage, as I said, this issue of persuading or negotiating what the past means for the present has to be always our starting point. The issues that we are dealing with are in the here and now. Yes, there are issues that are going to that are important for the future. But if we constantly are talking always about the future, we don't engage with the past. That is, real change it happens here in the here and now. And that is what heritage is primarily for me, a negotiation of how do we change? How do we deal with change, and how do we change? That will set aspirations for the future. And in my talk, I talked about its relationship with the near future. We can't make predictions about the distant future. That's not our place to do so. We need to have the aspirations that we want for the near future by engaging with the present. And I know there is a lot of debate in heritage studies, particularly critical heritage studies, about the need to consider the future. Yes. The near future, absolutely. But we have to be wary not to fall into the trap that was set by the authorised discourse, that we are preserving stuff for the future, which then, and that discourse, what that discourse tends to do is to disenfranchise the present from making changes. So, yeah, I'm not ashamed of talking about, you know, how heritage is important in and for the future, and how that then, of course, sets aspirations. So that article about nostalgia, for instance, that you talked about, the community that I was working with there, a community going through deindustrialisation in the UK called Castleford, talked about nostalgia for the future, progressive nostalgia or healing nostalgia, that this was about taking aspects of the past. It was not about returning to the past. It was taking aspects of the past that were important, community solidarity, certain adherence to values that the community, political values and social values that the community thought were important, and bringing them to the present to help set aspirations for the future. Hence nostalgia for the future. So, so yes, I think all of that is interlinked. And the third question, I'm not sure I understood the question, but you're talking about the materialization of emotion. Talking about the materialization of motion. Okay, so by materialization, I'm assuming you mean its impact, or do you mean in terms of the monuments? Okay, when does emotion come to matter? Yeah, it tends to matter when we notice it, and we notice it when it's hot. So when we get angry or when we get joyful. But emotion is always underpinning everything we do. And the point that I'm making about what I term flat emotions is the idea that A, emotions are always with us, and B, that we will experience emotions without actually realising that we are doing so, and thus not see the work that that emotion is doing. So the comforting emotion, the indifference, those are emotions that do things, but we often don't realise. We think we're not being emotional unless we're being hot about our emotions. So I'm saying we need to understand the whole diversity of the emotional field. So in the book Emotional Heritage, I develop an idea about registers of engagement, which basically says there's flat, there's hot, there's in-between types of emotions, and we need to look at the broad sweep of the emotional response and what that does to people's practice and their thinking and how they engage with heritage, and thus understand the material impact, what that does to people and what it does to society. I hope that's answered the question. Thank you. And thank you thank you, all the three of you, for your questions.
Perfecto. Ahí están.
Gracias. Primero que todo, agradecerle estar acá. La verdad es que para mí es súper importante. Yo soy Elena Cordero, formo parte de una colectiva que se llama Quilombo Negrocentrics, acá en Santiago de Chile, también en México ya. Y también tengo un proyecto en torno a la trenza que se llama Trenzología. Y bueno, agradecer porque la verdad es que para mí estos espacios son súper relevantes. Y mi pregunta gira en torno al concepto de reconciliación. Ya, me gustaría preguntar cuáles considera usted que son los desafíos que conlleva en la práctica la realización de esta propuesta, entendiendo que conceptos como el multiculturalismo, como incluso el concepto de identidad, han sido la interseccionalidad. Hoy por hoy son conceptos que también han sido cooptados por los fundamentalismos, ¿no? Entonces, ¿cuál sería el desafío que tiene el concepto de la reconciliación a la hora de una práctica y cuáles propone o qué propone como puntos claves para abordar esto y como eso, como evitar esta cooptación, ¿no? Es decir, una reconciliación en tanto a qué pasa si los pueblos o las comunidades a las que se les propone la reconciliación no les adecúa, ¿no? ¿Qué pasa si los mismos fundamentalismos toman este concepto de reconciliación para llevarlos a sus agendas? Como eso básicamente es mi pregunta, ¿no? Gracias.
Hola, muchas gracias por la presentación. Tenía una pregunta que justamente se vincula mucho con la pregunta que acaban de realizar y tiene que ver con los objetivos que Laurajane estableció en un comienzo de su investigación, que era identificar las prácticas hegemónicas, llamar la atención sobre las diversidades del patrimonio y finalmente desafiar el discurso patrimonial autorizado. Y mi pregunta va en relación con esto último, sobre si es que han habido algunas estrategias o prácticas que ha visto a lo largo de sus investigaciones respecto a cómo desafiar el patrimonio autorizado y cómo poder crear este nuevo set de prácticas dominantes o discursos dominantes que sea crítico y que sea más consciente en el fondo de las disputas identitarias, de las disputas en torno al patrimonio que ya existen en los territorios.
Hola, ¿qué tal? Muy buenas tardes. Primero que nada, me gustaría agradecer por su presentación, particularmente por la puesta en crítica que usted ha puesto respecto a la categoría de patrimonio. Para mí eso es fundamental, sobre todo en un contexto chileno, donde lo patrimonial, en relación en particular con el museo, está puesta en debate. Yo considero, y quisiera partir con un pequeño comentario antes de formular mi pregunta, considero que en efecto las prácticas museales en general están muy arraigadas en el contexto chileno en ciertos principios del siglo XIX. Fundamentalmente, la idea de crear un sistema que unifique lo heterogéneo en una suerte de mismidad. Eso se puede apreciar en cualquier museo en general y que uno podría denominar a la pieza patrimonial museal como botín, algo atemporal, desarraigado de cualquier uso social y en ese sentido una experiencia totalmente delimitada por las curatorias. Ahora bien, su presentación para mí abre ese concepto de lo patrimonial a nuevas dimensiones de exploración, como es el tema de la emoción. Remitiéndome solamente a la presentación de usted de hoy, me generan ciertos espacios de exploración muy provocativos. En primer lugar, considerando que las emociones también son culturales, están también caracterizadas, si se quiere, articuladas por el idioma, eh, una primera pregunta sería, ¿deberíamos abocarnos a los estudios del patrimonio a partir de casos particulares? ¿Podría existir un discurso interregional o interidiomático, si se quiere, sobre el patrimonio? Y lo segundo, considerando el contexto solo chileno, pero se podría remitir también a Latinoamérica, ¿qué pasa en sociedades donde el pasado se ha construido desde lo mestizo, desde lo híbrido? ¿Cómo podríamos construir una relación con lo patrimonial desde ese punto de vista, a partir de lo mestizo? Eso, muchísimas gracias.
Bueno, primero muchas gracias nuevamente. Bueno, mi pregunta la tenía escrita, la estaba formulando todavía, así que voy directo a ella para no robar tanto tiempo. Y es con respecto a las formas actuales de nosotros relacionarnos con el patrimonio. Y es que pasa que estamos en una realidad donde muchas personas ven el patrimonio cultural como únicamente como una decoración. Esto pasa en los días del patrimonio, el O Santiago, donde la gente sale a decir como, oh, qué bonito. Entonces, no generan una conexión emocional como realmente importante con esto. ¿Cuál debería ser nuestro rol, al menos como nosotros, que al menos aquí está la mayoría de mis compañeros de conservación? Es nuestra responsabilidad crear estrategias que democraticen el acceso emocional al patrimonio, como adaptándolo a los gustos contemporáneos y a las nuevas tecnologías, o debemos mantener la rigurosidad histórica, aceptando que no todos van a conectar con el patrimonio.
Hola, gracias. Bueno, mi nombre es Paz Undurraga. Desde el sitio Patrimonio Mundial de Valparaíso, un poco quiero transmitir una experiencia que tiene que ver con las prácticas de intercambio. Le quería preguntar si la resignación, la frustración, me imagino que están dentro del campo de las posibles emociones que tienen que ver frente a unos modelos de desarrollo económico, turístico, un poco implantado. Entonces, un poco ligándome a las preguntas anteriores a las dos últimas, ¿qué estrategias ve usted como para revertir, corregir algunos ya prácticas ya instaladas en los territorios? Eso, no me extiendo más.
Ahí hay una sexta pregunta. Voy a pasar, no sé por dónde pasar el micrófono, para que llegue más rápido.
Muchas gracias por la presentación. Mi pregunta va sobre el tema como central acerca de los usos sociales del patrimonio. Lo pensaba sobre todo en las posibilidades de este, pero en contextos variados. Por ejemplo, pienso en cómo el patrimonio puede aportar o cómo puede tener una implicancia en contextos, por ejemplo, carcelarios o de encierro. O sea, claro, está el contexto carcelario por un lado de adultos privados de libertad, pero hay otros contextos de encierro que también perjudica a infancia y juventudes vulneradas. Pienso, por ejemplo, en Mejor Niñez, lo que era Exename, ¿cierto? Estos niños que han sido vulnerados y se encuentran en residencias donde muchas veces no reciben escolarización, los colegios no los admiten. Pienso en cómo el patrimonio se puede, por ejemplo, hacer cargo de esas problemáticas que están súper presentes en nuestro país. También, por ejemplo, desde, no sé, cada vez que hay votaciones, no sé, por presidente, un tema a abordar y un desafío es, por ejemplo, la seguridad nacional, ¿no? Que ha estado como muy mediatizado. Pienso sobre todo en esas dos líneas, pero particularmente en cómo llegar o cómo se puede mediar en estos espacios que son de encierro. Igual se ha visto como de forma quizás más cercana el trabajo educativo ahí de mediación desde los museos que salen a estos espacios, pero igual ahí es un contexto complejo. O sea, si pienso particularmente en estas residencias de niños, igual es complejo, por ejemplo, la apropiación. No creo que, me parece que puede que sea indeseado el apropiarse de un espacio que es donde no desean estar, donde no se les permite el juego, pero sí tiene mucha importancia lo emotivo, el buen trato, la dignidad también, que es algo a lo que imagino se aspira.
Sorry, I'm just making sure that I get back to your question. Okay. 6, right. I'll go sequentially again. So as I understood the first question, asking about the challenges to reconciliation and how do we tackle that? And actually, the answer to this question also, I would also say, speaks to the following questions 3 through 6 in different ways. Look, one of the big issues with reconciliation is that I can't speak for Chile, but certainly in the context in which I am research familiar, and also in the Australian context, is it is never very clear what we mean by reconciliation. Who is reconciliating what, for what purposes, who benefits from this? And I think that ultimately is a question that needs to be driving this debate. Who's it for? Why are we doing it? Who's going to benefit? and what do we mean by it, which tends not to be done. And certainly what I'm seeing coming out of the project that I'm involved in now, that heritage, again, with this sense of, shared heritage, this idea that, heritage should be shared, has been utilised in the reconciliation debate to plaster over and hide diversity and dissent, and that, we'll all be, have this kumbaya moment. We'll all be cuddly and good together, and it'll all be good because it just will, because that's what heritage does. It makes us feel good. And that relates back to the last question. Not all heritage is good, and even good, even the heritage we stick on national or world heritage lists will have its own. All heritage is dissonant. Basically, there will be any act of heritage making excludes and may also engage with the legitimisation of certain injustices and so on. So understanding and unpacking what we mean by heritage and how we are utilising heritage, I think, is the first step in its engagement with any context, but in particular because of the work I'm doing with reconciliation. And we need to understand that actually heritage can be used by the state to plaster over real reconciliation, real truth telling, and what that means. Moving to the second question, yes, my goal has been to identify the authorised discourse, and I understood the question to be asking where have I seen challenges to that discourse? I see challenges to that discourse every day in the ways that communities who exist outside of state-sanctioned notions of heritage construct their own sense of place and identity and well-being, belonging, and so on. And it is, as I said, one of the reasons for identifying that discourse is to understand that there are a whole range of heritage practices that exist outside of it, and we need to be paying more attention to that, so that we can develop more inclusive practices. Has this been occurring? Yes, I have seen attempts in places by colleagues who have attempted to challenge that. The whole Intangible Cultural Heritage Convention could be read as a challenge to the authorised discourse. It was a challenge to the Eurocentrism of world heritage. But as I've written in a 2017 paper, there are ways in which the authorised discourse fights back, alas, and it has reworked aspects of intangible cultural heritage in such a way that it's just become another list of pretty heritage, and not done the things that the people writing that convention wanted it to do. But I think the biggest thing we need to do to challenge the authorised heritage discourse is not, as I've seen many people do in their work in utilising this concept, is make the assumption that this is some beast that has its own agency and we become victims of it. We make choices, always make choices as to what practices we're going to engage. And yes, those choices may be constrained by our position in as state experts and the law and whatever, but we have to continually push forward in making self-conscious, aware choices about the practices and the values that we're employing in our work. We have to take a position and acknowledge that position and the political values and social values that underlie it, and negotiate those with the people with whom and the communities and other stakeholders with whom we work. Is that easy? No, it's not easy. Of course it's not. But as I was saying to someone before, that striking the pose of the objective, neutral expert is as much a political statement with its own risks and abilities to be criticised as taking a position. Well, here I am as whatever it is, as a feminist, speaking as for myself, as a feminist who adopts, or aspires to adopt progressive politics and to push that forward in the Australian context, that that we are honest about what we're doing and why we're doing it, what our motivations are. And that's where I've seen real changes happen in practice, when people are being honest and upfront and willing to discuss and debate, not only with the state apparatus, but also with the stakeholders or community groups with which they work. But it's an ongoing project. It's a long-term project that we all need to be engaged in. Okay. The third question I understood was asking about, made the point that emotions are cultural. Absolutely. And I think was asking, is there a potential for a interlanguage consideration of heritage and the emotions that engage with it, if I understood? The debate certainly the debate in critical heritage studies has been very much dominated by Anglophone debates, absolutely. And there are translations of how heritage is used, the emotionalities of that don't make it into English for a range of reasons. And I think it's really important that we start opening up a debate. She says, as being someone who only speaks English, that makes it, I understand the hypocrisy of what I'm saying, but we need to engage in broader dialogues, to have the ideas expressed in Spanish, Portuguese, French, and so on, translated into English, and vice versa. We need to be doing that in critical heritage studies. So yes, it's a project that is very much at the heart of some of my colleagues, such as Lucy Morrissey, who's very keen to facilitate that sort of dialogue. And I think that, as you say, it's very, in terms of emotion, it's very much culturally defined, the sort of how we understand and engage with our emotions. Absolutely. So some of the observations that I've been making about emotions are very much, I understand, constrained to Anglo contexts, Anglophone contexts. But yeah, so I entirely agree. And I think we need to be working closer together to open up the debate and open up the theoretical implications of that debate. Okay, so the fourth question, how do we get people to engage with emotion beyond the pretty? Well, they are engaged. I mean, they are engaging with emotion. If it's something that they see as aesthetically pleasing, that is a form of engagement. And that actually does a lot of things. The aesthetics, whether we realise it or not, is upholding received narratives of national heritage making. So, that you're seeing something pretty, it's nice, it's comforting, that is an engagement. It's a maybe a banal engagement, but it's a very powerful engagement. And that sort of sense of comfort and prettiness is the really hard thing to challenge and to overcome. So how do we do this? How do we get people connecting to heritage in more critical ways, is how I read your question. How do we get them, how do we start challenging their the tendency to want to reinforce what they already know and feel? We have to engage with the emotions. We have to start looking at understanding how emotions work in heritage and start utilising those emotions to challenge. There are museum practices that do that. There are some very good examples of curatorial attempts to challenge people's emotional commitments. And the work that I've done in those contexts has shown that actually you start providing people with the space to emotionally experiment and to feel safe enough to be challenged. You get people going, oh, I never thought about it that way. And one of the things that was important when people did start to engage in a way that challenged their beliefs was the ability of the interpretive staff of the museum to engender empathy. Now, empathy has had a bad press. There are, in some debates and museological research has argued that empathy can be this emotion where, for instance, someone from the dominant ethnic background of a nation, in my case, say white Australian, goes and to a place of talking about challenges to the national narrative and go, oh yes, I felt the sadness of another, and been there, done that, and got the T-shirt, and off we go, and we don't have to think about it anymore. And yes, that can happen. This is why I was talking about the idea of registers of engagement. So that is a shallow form of empathy that does nothing but reinforce white privilege in the Australian case. If we are going to be engaging with them, actively engaging with emotions, we need to understand the different registers, the depth. So imaginative empathy that is deeply felt, that is deeply triggered, and is combined with issues of imagination. We're able to get people moving slightly, and in sometimes quite significantly, along the pathway of going, oh, I had never thought about it that way. This is new to me. So yeah, there are some, as I said, some museums like the Immigration Museum in Melbourne, the National Civil Rights Museum in Memphis, Tennessee, and some other places that are not afraid and actively work with the emotionality of what they're dealing with. That actually has helped increase engagement. Valparaiso. What strategies can we do to connect with new practices? And I think, and I understand I gather that in the question there's an issue of frustrations with the economic and touristic utilizations of that city. And what can heritage professionals, as I read the question, do to develop new practices? And again, I go back to choice, the issue of choice. We make choices to engage our practice within the authorised discourse or not. And I think, again, it comes back to being honest about our positionality and utilising that in debates with the stakeholders who are involved in wanting to do things with heritage, whether that's the city of Valparaiso or the community heritage down the street. Children and prisons. What you're really asking about trauma. How does heritage engage with issues of trauma? The answer is it doesn't. I mean, we like to think that, as I said, heritage is healing and cuddly and makes us feel good. And yes, it does. But if your social experiences aren't within that heritage, no, it doesn't. All it does is exclude and make the injustices that you experience in daily life emotionally more, difficult to deal with and to address. There is actually a lot of work coming out of Australia, led by a woman called Jacqueline Wilson and Frank Golding, who were themselves children who were raised in institutions and who engage with prisoners in Australia. And as their work illustrates, that how heritage tends to be used in those contexts is to regulate the conduct of prisoners and institutionalised children, to help negate the legitimacy of their experiences and to get them to conform to a shared heritage. So again, part of the issues that we need to be dealing with is moving outside of the authorised discourse, looking at how those communities themselves engage with their heritage, specifically how they deal with their own sense of loss and injustice. And again, within deindustrialising communities that I've worked with, how do they deal with issues of loss, anger, all the emotions that we don't see as part of the feeling rules of heritage will help us understand how we get to new practices of heritage making that are far more inclusive, that help us to develop new agendas and aspirations for the near future and the present. I'm not sure who asked the question, but did I, about the children, is that what you meant? Have I answered the question? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Laurajane. Muchas gracias, Laurajane, por compartir, por esta conversación. Gracias a todos y a todas por haber estado en este espacio. Podemos seguir conversando con unos refrescos aquí afuera. También aprovecho a agradecer a todos y a todas quienes ayudaron en la organización de este seminario. Muchas gracias.
Yeah. Thank you.